Okay, I think I'll get us started and introduce the speaker. Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Margaret Graves. I'm Associate Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture in the History of Art and Architecture Department. And before I even introduce today's speaker, I want to begin by thanking the Center for Middle East Studies, especially Barbara and Ilyas and Teresa, for organizing this event. And I also want to give formal thanks to the Islam and the Humanities Initiative, the Department of Comparative Literature, the Department of History, and History of Art and Architecture, and the Center for the Study of the Early Modern World, all of whom have supported Professor Losensky's visit. So Paul Losensky is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature at Indiana University, Bloomington. And at IU, he taught Persian language and literature, translation theory and practice, and comparative studies of Western and Middle Eastern literatures. His honors are many, and I'm not going to list them all, but I do want to mention that he has very recently been a Fellow of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and before that, a Fellow of the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. His research focuses on the Persian poetry of the early modern period, and his books to date include Welcoming Figani, Imitation and Poetic Individuality in the Safavid Mughal Ghazal, that was 1998, Farid-ad-Din Attar's Memorial of God's Friends, Lives and Sayings of Sufis in 2009, and In the Bazaar of Love, Selected Poems of Amir Khusro in 2013 with Sunil Sharma. And Professor Losensky is currently working on a book that will present the work of the master poet of the 17th century, Sa'ib Tabrizi, as well as a new edition and translation of Nal-o-Daman by the 16th century poet laureate of the Mughal court, Abul Faiz Faizi. So most of this you could get direct from Paul's CV or his online profile, but I also want to invoke a slightly more personal dimension to Paul's career. So in Bloomington and beyond, Paul has been advisor and mentor to an entire generation of scholars of Persian poetry and literature, and has even been a willing mentor to some lucky art historians, myself included. I first met Paul not long after I arrived in Bloomington when I started a job on the tenure track in the art history department at Indiana. And in Paul, I found a truly extraordinary colleague and interlocutor. Over the years that we've worked together in Indiana, Paul has always been ready to share his thoughts about the visual and literary arts, to read drafts, he's read a lot of my work, and to think through images and objects and texts together. His articles on the symbiotic relationships between architecture and poetry in early modern Iran, they are pieces of writing that I have returned to over and over again, and every time I read them, I see the built world around me in a slightly different way. The lecture that he's going to present today is related to that research on the mutual interrelationships between architecture and literature and poetry, turning this time to an earlier period of Persian poetry and the late 12th century masterpiece, the Khamsa of Nezāmi. His lecture today is entitled Tents and Fortresses, Palaces and Caves, Literary Architectures in Nezāmi's Book of Alexander. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Uh-oh, I'm actually doing this right. Okay, I got over that hurdle. So thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, Margaret. And I would like to begin myself by thanking Margaret Graves, who is a very dear friend and close colleague back from our days in Indiana. And thanks as well to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at Brown for helping me pull together the logistics of getting here today. So since Margaret is an art historian by trade, by the way, the opening, you will see little illustrations of various depictions of Alexander the Great. I love this one. This is Richard Burton, who played Alexander the Great in a memorable film, memorable maybe for all the wrong reasons in the 1950s, but there he is. So in any case, there it is. There we are. So since Margaret's an art historian by trade, I thought that I would take up my work in the comparative arts for this talk. and in particular, and here's the word, the symbiotic relationship between literature and architecture. Literature often serves architecture. Versified dedicatory inscriptions, travelogues, and eulogistic descriptions of palaces and cities celebrate and explicate built structures and their significance. In his book Epic Space, for example, the architect Anthony Antoniadis offers an ambitious exploration of the nexus of literature and architecture. He examines epic poems stretching from Gilgamesh to the Kalevala in a quest to, quote, move toward the roots of Western architecture, as is announced in the subtitle of the book. I, too, have written extensively about various poems praising buildings and their builders in the early modern Persianate world. This talk again takes up the nexus of poetry and architecture, but from kind of the opposite perspective. In other words, how does architecture serve literature? How do encounters with imagined buildings serve to structure plot, to delineate character, and to give concrete shape to central thematic issues of the work? This talk is an experiment in what Kenneth Burke might call scenic reading, taking the where of setting or scene, and in this case particularly the built environment, as a guide to the who, what, and why of fictional narrative and the architectonics of the work as a whole. The subject of my little experiment today is the Eskandarnāmeh, or the Book of Alexander, by the renowned Persian poet Nezāmi Ganjavi, who was born around 1125 and died circa 1206. His 5 narrative poems, known collectively as the Khamseh, or the Quintet, are landmarks in Persian narrative poetry and were frequently imitated and illustrated over the following centuries. And we'll see a few of the illustrations in the PowerPoint. Several of these poems in the Quintet feature significant descriptions of architecture. But due to Alexander's incessant travels, the Book of Alexander includes the widest variety of architectural types. This poem consists of 2 parts. The first, the Travelogues, deals with Alexander's conquests and draws on earlier romances of Alexander from the Hellenistic tradition. The second part, the Ekphrastic, places Alexander in a more strictly Islamic context. He's identified with the prophet Zulqarnain, the two-horned, who's mentioned briefly and very fleetingly in the Quran. 2 building projects, in fact, serve to frame the entire work, though as we shall see, neither is quite as significant as first appears. After Alexander first demonstrates his military prowess in a cosmographic, racially coded battle with the Zangis, or the Ethiopians, at the start of the poem, his first order of business is to build the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And moving to the end of the work, just before his death, he erects a defensive wall to prevent the demonic forces of Gog and Magog from invading the civilized world from the north. In between these 2 episodes, Alexander encounters many kinds of architecture, from tents and fortresses that are central to his military ventures, to palaces, religious sites, and tombs. These episodes track an evolving ambivalence towards the architecture of urban civilization and military power. As Alexander repeatedly discovers, architecture makes a false promise of permanence. Sorry, here we go, there's his itinerary there. As Alexander repeatedly discovers, architecture makes a false promise of permanence in a world subject to constant change. And we'll be stopping along these, at each of these places as we go through the talk. So, oops, I keep hitting the wrong one. One mark of Alexander's legitimacy as an agent of civilization is the construction of cities. as set forth in the plot summary that comes in the Synnaghanámeh near the beginning of the work. With every turn around the compass of the world, he founded several splendid cities. From Hindustan all the way to Rome, he raised a city from every land. Rome here meaning Byzantium and the Greek world in general. The list of cities founded by Alexander is impressive. Alexandria, Tbilisi, Herat, and Samarkand, among several others. Considering the number of cities he establishes, however, it is surprising how little textual space is devoted to these episodes. The construction of Alexandria is summed up in 5 verses, and 2 verses are sufficient to cover the building of Samarkand. Remember, this is a work of 10,000 verses. The account of the construction of Herat is dispensed with briskly. Just there, where he had killed his enemies, there was a hill near the plain. In thanks for the blessing of good health, he quickly threw up a foundation on that hill. When he made it flourish with the trappings of wealth, he named it Hadi, or Herat, in the Pahlavi tongue. So in sum, only about 25 of the Book of Alexander's 10,000 verses are really devoted to his role as a builder of cities. And interestingly, he never pauses long enough to take up residence in any of the cities that he founds. As the first verse here that I have quoted indicates, this act of construction is generally preceded by violence and destruction. Building an empire is a messy and bloody business, and far more verses describe the desecration of Zoroastrian fire temples than the foundation of cities. Alexander's conquest of northeastern Iran, Khorasan, is dominated by the slaughter of the supporters of the deposed Persian king Darius and the destruction of Zoroastrian fire temples. His arrival in Balkh and the desecration of the Azar-Goshasp temple is typical of this activity. He came to Balkh, and he extinguished Zoroaster's fire like water with a storm of swords. In Balkh, there was a temple to fire the heart that left the mouths of fresh roses bitter with envy. In it, there were fairy-like figures like paintings, idol chambers like the joyous spring. In it, there were coins and treasure beyond measure stashed in every corner without toiling hands. When the king got hold of that treasure house, he found the priests drunk from the Magian goblet. He emptied the angels from that paradisiac idol house and expelled those worshippers of hell. He polished off that ancient treasure and with it applied a salve to many a breast. Despite their architectural beauty, in the world of the Book of Alexander, Zoroastrian fire temples are places where wealth is hoarded, virgins held captive, and wine consumed. Alexander plunders and lays waste to them mercilessly wherever he finds them in Iran. Such episodes have no real counterpart in earlier accounts of Alexander. And they're really one element in Nezāmi's project to depict Alexander as a prophet, the Quranic figure of the two-horned. He's kind of a prophet in training and a holy warrior who destroys idolatry to make way for a new monotheistic faith. After pillaging the architectural and cultural heritage of these conquered lands, Alexander perhaps applies a salve to his own breast by distributing booty to the populace. There we go. Alexander's indifference to architectural luxury and display is also apparent in his first encounter with Nushabeh, the Amazonian queen of the Caucasian city of Barda. When Alexander comes to her court disguised as his own emissary, he is first struck by the opulence of her palace. Although she takes her seat behind a curtain, she devotes herself to building all day. She has a lofty, kingly palace that is spread with precious carpets. She erected a throne of crystal upon which are poured loads of pearls. Nushabeh in this passage is described as emarat parast, yani a devotee of construction. But even she's confounded when she travels with her court to Alexander's encampment outside the city. This encampment presents a dazzling sight. When that Fae saw the king's encampment, she saw world upon world of troops and tents. Because of all the gold embroidered banners, the sky turned pink and the plains violet. Because of all the tents adorned with gold, she could not find her way to the king's door. She asked directions and came to the king's threshold. She saw the top of a pavilion reaching the moon's zenith, a court raised on silken ropes with poles of gold and pegs of pure silver. There gives you an idea of what one of these encampments could look like. The splendor of the mobile architecture of Alexander's tents rivals any palace Nushabeh might erect. The palace, as a symbol of royal pomp and established rule, is kind of gendered feminine here. And when Barda is destroyed by the Russians at the end of the first part of the Book of Alexander, Alexander leaves it to the queen Nushabeh to rebuild the city. The tent, on the other hand, belongs to the male world of military power and conquest. The tent serves as a master metaphor for Alexander's subjugation and reordering of the world. He raised a four-sided pavilion that beat out its summons on the 9 heavens. One of its pegs was at the North Pole. Another was planted in the southern expanse. One of its ropes he stretched to the east. Another of its ropes reached to the west. The conventional architectural metaphors for the cosmos in Persian literature are the dome or the vaulted archway. But here they're replaced by a square tent, a geometrical transformation that emphasizes the imposed rational order to which all conquerors aspire. When Alexander does occasionally pack up his tents to settle for a spell in one place, his preferred form of permanent structure is the fortress, the Hesar, again highlighting the militaristic side of his character. Having defeated the Iranian king Darius and entered the city of Esfahan, Alexander resolves to marry the royal princess, Roshanak, and the fortress becomes a metaphor for a military and sexual conquest that's framed as an act of liberation. As Alexander himself says, "I will erect a fortress in his bedroom. I will raise the heads of his underlings," referring to Darius. The fortress again serves as a metaphor when, following a feast in honor of Queen Nushabeh, Alexander gathers his generals together to announce his strategic plans for the future. He erected such a fortress from that company that the stars disappeared in that tower. In the tower of this metaphorical fortress, Alexander reveals that instead of returning home to Rome, he intends to, quote, "see the world from end to end and bring all the kingdoms of the world into his hands." His ultimate goal, however, I'm not sure what happened to the Persian when this happened, but anyway, his ultimate goal, however, is not just spreading fame and amassing fortune, but as he declares, "in every land and country of the earth, let me see which people are happy. Perhaps I can get a share of that happiness, for only iron can work on iron." Okay. In this context, the proverb, "only iron can strike iron," is rather jarring. The sense seems to be that happy people can perhaps make him happy too. But the metaphor in the proverb presents happiness as kind of a material object that can be shaped through fire and brute force. When Alexander does discover a truly happy people, as we shall see, this proverb turns out to be utterly inappropriate. His encounter with the city of the blessed, the last episode in the romance, his encounter with the city of the blessed will leave Alexander in despair and stand in rebuke of the iron-forged violence that has dominated much of his life. But Alexander still has many miles to travel and many wonders to behold before reaching the city of the blessed. Continuing his journey through the Caucasus, he sets out from Nushabeh's city of Barda to travel to the city of Darband, but his path is blocked by a mountain fortress. The residents of this fortress don't come out from behind the walls to pay homage to Alexander or to engage in battle with him. Alexander's forces spend 40 days bombarding this fortress with catapults and trebuchets to no avail. When his generals come back to Alexander to report their frustration, he asks whether anyone knows of a hermit or a recluse who lives in the vicinity. And he is told of a hermit who lives in a certain cave, refusing human company and subsisting on grass. Alexander sets out immediately for the cave where this hermit lives, with only a single companion. When they arrive there, the recluse emerges from his cave and greets Alexander by name. Alexander kneels down in the cave before the hermit and introduces himself, saying, "God split a piece of iron into two halves. He delivered the two to the two of us. He etched a key and a sword on them. The key belongs to you. The sword he left to me." As in the proverb we just examined, Alexander again uses iron as a source of his metaphor. The literal iron of the sword is forged into the spiritual power of the hermit. The metaphor of iron again seems a little inappropriate. The sword gains entrance by violence. The key permits licit and peaceful entry. A denizen of the fortress, Alexander is a native speaker of the language of force. Alexander explains, there we go. This is an illustration of that. You can see the hermit at the bottom and the fortress at the top. Alexander explains that he needs the hermit's help in overcoming a fortress inhabited by a band of robbers and highwaymen. The hermit unleashes a single breath that proves more powerful than any catapult. When Alexander returns to camp, he is met by the warden of the fortress, who hands over its keys to him without argument, relating that two of the towers of the fortress had suddenly collapsed. Alexander bestows land grants on the robbers who lived in this fortress and were flushed from their stronghold, so that they can turn from a life of crime. He rebuilds the fortress, and then further constructs another series of fortified outposts to protect the populace from incursions from the nomadic marauders to the north. Despite the peaceful resolution of this story and its confirmation of the hermit's spiritual power, there's perhaps an architectural lesson in this episode that escapes Alexander. The sudden collapse of this seemingly impregnable fortress demonstrates the vulnerability of even the stoutest defensive structure. Yet Alexander not only rebuilds the fortress of Darband, but constructs a series of additional fortresses. It will take many more such lessons before Alexander fully grasps that fortresses offer little protection against the march of time. There we go. The fortress here is posed against the cave of the saintly recluse. This cave fulfills two typical architectural functions. It provides shelter, like a house, and creates a sacred space, like a church or a mosque, the sacred space in which this recluse dwells. Archaeological remains and cave paintings demonstrate that caves have served such purposes since Neolithic times. But do caves count as architecture? Since they're not built by humans, the answer would seem to be no. Consider, however, a case like the Buddhist Hindu caves at Ajanta in western India. Initially, they likely began as solitary retreats for religious contemplation, but they were gradually elaborated into granaries, assembly rooms, and temples. Natural caves were expanded and shaped, and new ones excavated. The cave kind of provides an architectural degree zero against which other types of buildings can be measured and judged. Here, the cave proves to be mightier than the citadel. A cave also plays a significant but very different role in Alexander's next lesson in the transience of political power. Having settled his affairs in Darband, Alexander hears the fable of Sarir, the fortress and tomb of the last and the mightiest of the legendary Iranian kings, the Khanate kings, Khosrow. As soon as Alexander hears about this story of Khosrow, his great predecessor, he's raring to go. When he heard of its characteristics that night, he felt the desire to see that fortress. Perhaps from the ancient goblet of Khosrow, he could renew the kingdom's assembly. As he sets out, he expresses his hope that the sight of the fortress and the goblet will polish the mirror of his soul, which has been eaten away by rust. When Alexander arrives at the fortress, the very walls of the building call out and announce that he is the second Khosrow. The keepers of the fortress escort Alexander to Khosrow's throne and show him the dead monarch's magical goblet. But Alexander sits on the throne for only a moment and takes only a single sip from the goblet. The luxurious trappings of royal power now appear to him as empty symbols. He gazed upon that throne, lacking a king. He wept for a while over that goblet, lacking wine. Over that goblet and empty throne, the lack of wine and the lack of a king, he uttered this saying, "Let there be no golden throne without a king. Let there be no wine. Let there be no world-seeing goblet." After Alexander's meditation on these permanent signs of ephemeral power, the narrative resumes with Alexander leaving the fortress to visit the cave where Khosrow is buried. This cave is hidden in the mountains at the end of a desolate footpath, and Alexander's guide warns him against the trip. But accompanied by his loyal philosopher Balinus, Alexander presses on, squeezing into the narrow opening of the cave to discover that it is illuminated by a light that seems to have no source. The light, as it turns out, emanates from a pit, and Balinus lowers himself into the pit to discover that the light comes from burning sulfur. Although Balinus tells Alexander that this sulfurous fire is the product of alchemy, it is hard not to see in this pit a vision of hell or the chthonic forces of annihilation. The cave is now an entrance to the underworld, a dark realm illuminated only by death. King and philosopher beat a hasty retreat, King and philosopher beat a hasty retreat. Even more than the empty throne, the cave offers a stark reminder of mortality and the evanescence of political power. The fortress may survive. The king who built it does not. Alexander returns at the end of this adventure to the tents where he's most comfortable, and throws a banquet to celebrate life's fleeting pleasures in the face of death. Following this episode, he continues his campaign to India and China, returns to the city of Baghdad, and explores the land of darkness before he returns to his home in Rome, bringing the first half of the Book of Alexander to an end. Ready for part two. In the second part of the Book of Alexander, the Eskandarnāmeh, Alexander turns prophet, and the terms of his engagement with architecture change accordingly. Our first encounter with Alexander in the Eskandarnāmeh finds him sitting in a simple hut. He had a hidden house made from skins, no filigree on it of silver or gold, a hut constructed of red willow branches. In it, white sand scattered over the floor. Alexander, as it turns out, retires to this hut to worship and to give thanks to God. The simplicity of the structure signals, in architectural terms, Alexander's turn from warrior to explorer of both the inner and outer worlds. Alexander begins his exploration of the wonders of creation at the boundary of India, where he comes upon an idol temple named Kandahar, which contains a tall idol with eyes made of two gemstones. Which contains a tall idol with eyes made of two gemstones. Alexander is preparing to destroy this temple, just as he had the fire temples in Iran, when he is approached by one of the idol's attendants, who tells him the story of why the idol and the temple were constructed. The building was once a palace that had fallen into ruins, with only half the dome left standing. One day, two birds landed on what was left of the palace, carrying two precious jewels in their beaks. They let the jewels drop to the ground and flew away. Fearing a fight over the possession of these jewels, the city elders decide to erect an idol and to use jewels for its eyes. The attendant ends her appeal to Alexander to preserve the temple by saying, all eyes take their light from the sun. Why would the son Alexander take our eyes from us? The enlightened rarely blow out a lamp that makes the blind cheerful. Don't make a few widows burn with remorse. Don't leave the widow's night without a lamp. Alexander is persuaded and departs the city, leaving the idol and the temple intact. Rather than plundering the riches from the temple as he would have earlier, he opens the treasury to distribute, rather than plundering the riches from the temple, he opens his own treasury to distribute its wealth among the people. Regardless of doctrine, Alexander here acknowledges the social usefulness of the idol and the comfort it brings to the poor and bereft. The temple, built from the ruins of a palace, represents the superiority, I would suggest, of communal practice over monarchical rule. Alexander's travels then take him to the Garden of Eden, which echoes his earlier visit to the palace and gravesite of Khosrow, but it substitutes a Quranic allusion to the Garden of Eden for an allusion to the mythical history of ancient Iran. In the Garden of Eden, Alexander discovers a garden where the trees are made of gold, the fruit of precious gems, and its dust of musk. He enters a comparably luxurious palace and begins gathering riches until the skirt of his robe rips open from the weight of all the gold that he's collected. But as he exits the palace, he sees a black archway, the entrance to the tomb of the garden's builder, Shaddad ibn Ad. The tomb is adorned with a long inscription. This inscription asks the visitors not to disturb Shaddad's remains, yet acknowledges that both the tomb and body will soon be reduced to dust. For one who sleeps in this resting place, if they erect a dome made of black stone, in the end, the quickly turning dome of heaven will bring this dome down from the walls to the ground. It will make of his body salted meat for the ants. It will make of his head dust on the horse's hooves. The tomb erected to preserve the remains in memory of the deceased will suffer the same fate as the dead body. Time will destroy them both. The permanence of architecture is illusory. Even the most splendid of buildings are as transitory as human life and power, but simply on a slightly longer time scale. The inscription ends by inviting visitors to the tomb to help themselves to whatever treasure they find there, hoping that it will not be a burden to them. The irony of this generous offer in the inscription is not lost on Alexander. He drops the gold that he has gathered, prohibits his troops from taking any, and continues on his travel through the desert. The reassessment of architecture and its values is perhaps best epitomized by one of the most bizarre and fantastical episodes in the entire poem. Alexander hears the tale of some wondrous stones piled upon a beach. The stones come in every color, blue, yellow, gold, black, red, and cause those who gaze upon them to laugh themselves to death. In the longest account of architectural construction in the poem, Alexander orders that his men be blindfolded, the stones wrapped in canvas, and loaded onto rutting camels. They bring the stones to a place suitable for building. Then, by arranging those stones together in rows, he erected a lofty fortress without doors. And there is an illustration of that episode. So the outer walls of this new fortress, if you will, are plastered, plastered white, but the inner walls are exposed to reveal this fatal spectrum of colored stones. Alexander leaves this, how do we do this? Yes. Alexander leaves this fortress behind as a grim monument to his visit there. Every wayfarer who alighted there felt the need to see that fortress. He sought it out. When he saw no path to the parapet, he threw a lasso and clambered up. When he reached the parapet, he saw the stones. They stole his life like a magnet all at once. So those who scale the walls of this fortress will lose their lives in the gales of their own laughter. Alexander, in effect, leaves behind a monument to death. Now, I'm not the first person to notice the resemblance of this episode to the story of the city of brass in the 1001 Nights. In the Nights, the moral lessons to be drawn from the city of brass are spelled out at length. But the Book of Alexander makes no explicit explanation of why Alexander would build such a strange structure. And the story is left open to our interpretation. Is it a symbol of mortal human life in which we laugh bedazzled by all its variegated splendors only to be condemned to death? Does it represent the punishment meted out for excessive curiosity, a moral lapse of which Alexander is most certainly guilty? Read architecturally, this building is a mockery of the normal functions of a fortress. Its walls allow no ingress or egress, as though they were constantly under siege. And rather than protecting the people inside, this fortress annihilates them. It is militarily useless and stands as a monument to the potential lethalness of architectural endeavor. A final episode of defensive architecture rounds the Book of Alexander to its conclusion. And this is the erection of the wall to keep out the barbaric forces of Gog and Magog from invading Persia from the north. As one scholar has noticed, Nezāmi describes the construction of this wall against Gog and Magog in just 2 verses, far less than any other Persian Alexander romance devotes to this same episode. This brevity has been explained as an indication either that the poem was left incomplete at Nezāmi's death, or that he did not want to repeat material that could be found earlier in the poem or in other sources. I would suggest instead that this wall serves as a rather ironic prelude to the final city Alexander encounters on his adventures, the city of the blessed. A city appeared, adorned like paradise with riches and wealth. When he came to the narrow city gate, he saw no door of iron or wood or stone. He entered the city with several elders, all forward-thinking and alert to life's lessons. He found many well-stocked shops, doors and locks removed from them all. This city, in many ways, is a counterpart to the fortress of lethal stones. Both of the structures lack doors, but in much different ways. The lack of doors in the fortress means no way in. But in the city of the blessed, their absence allows free and unimpeded entry. The shops, too, stand open to all. This open architecture is made possible by the honesty, equity, if you will, and mutual respect of the populace. No one needs to steal. Everybody's got the same amount of goods. After all his wandering, Alexander has fulfilled his goal of finding a place where people are happy. This, in many ways, is his utopia, but it's a utopia where he cannot remain. The architecture, too, is utopian, offering habitation and shelter without exclusion, not unlike the cave where the recluse of Darban dwells. The city of the blessed stands as a critique of palaces, fortresses, and cities built to display prestige, power, and wealth. There is perhaps only one other kind of architecture with these same utopian qualities, and that is the poem itself. Nezāmi uses architectural metaphors several times in the Book of Alexander to characterize his act of writing. Pearl seeds, scattered from every door have I prepared like an idol house. From the first I set it on a foundation, so the walls of that house would stand straight. Anyone may enter the poem freely, like the city of the blessed, and enter it without fear of dying from the splendid colors as one would in the stone fortress. And unlike most buildings from Nezāmi's time, this literary structure continues to stand. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm supposed to resist my always temptation to wander around here because I need to stay by the microphone. So please, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them. Margaret. Oh, and by the way, I understand there are people out there in Zoom land who are also looking in. I forgot to welcome you at the beginning of my talk, so welcome now.
Try the other one.
Sorry, I'll quite the build-up.
It gives me.
Thanks. Okay, yes, that's definitely working. Thank you. So I wanted to jump in and ask the first question, if I may, which is to bring you. It's fascinating, and the Fortress of Lethal Stones is going to stay with me for a long time. I'd never heard about that part before. I wanted to bring you back to some of the questions around moral judgment that you set up in this, because I was wondering, is there a tension between, there are clearly moral judgments being offered in the poem that are around spaces and around types of space. Are they sometimes in tension, the moral judgments, with the way that the space is described? Because there is, of course, an emphasis, as is it sort of inevitable, there's quite a lot of emphasis on material beauty, material wealth, splendor, what things are made of, which sometimes seems like it's at odds with the moral lesson that we are, as you've shown, clearly supposed to be drawing.
Right.
So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, well, so mostly these are, what do I want to say, teachings that emerge from the narrative. There are a few places where Nezāmi explicitly kind of his voice enters the poem, and he'll draw some of these conclusions himself. But that's rare. Mostly what happens, at least the way I'm reading the poem, is that the narrative kind of goes back and forth with these various different spaces explicitly, so we can kind of go, what happened there? So it's Nezāmi is remarkably, although he does intervene, like I say, in the narrative from time to time in his own voice, he's really a remarkably kind of reticent narrator for the most part. And he lets these stories unfold and I think lets us draw the conclusions. And again, we're reading this poem probably against a more or less Sufi background. And so we're kind of ready for the fact that these signs of worldly wealth and well-being are kind of going to be subject to critique at one point or another. Does that get to your question? Yes.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, thank you so much. My middle name is named after Alexander, so it was really interesting learning about this. I didn't know very much beforehand. So I wanted to ask, as someone who doesn't know a whole lot about kind of this time period, if you could explain a little bit more, I know you touched on it, on the context on which the poem was written, and if that provides more insight on, describing Alexander as a prophet and, because of the writings of the time.
Right. So the city of Ganjavi, where Nezāmi was born and he lived most of his life in that area. It's in the Caucasus, in what we would think of as the modern Republic of Azerbaijan. And so a lot of his concern with sort of these northern invaders comes from the fact that, yes, he was in the Caucasus and the threat of nomads from the north was always present. He's running against two backgrounds. One of them is the background of the legends of the ancient kings of Iran. And he had three of the earlier works in his quintet had dealt with exactly that, had dealt with the legendary material that was associated with these kings in Iran, ancient kings of Iran. Alexander kind of brought all of that to an end. The other background that he's writing about is this very elusive figure who shows up, I think, once or twice. Quranic scholars can correct me, called Zulqarnain, which means the two-horned. And there's a lot of talk about why Alexander could be associated. One explanation is that he had helmets that had these two ram horns on the side of it. There are all kinds of other possible explanations. If you ever look at Michelangelo's statue of Moses, you notice that he has two little horns at the top, so it may have been carried over from that. In any case, this is a character no commentators on the Quran have tried forever to try and figure out who might be referred to. Nezāmi is quite happy with saying this is Alexander the Great. And so that's the other background that he's writing about. And the work is set up in these two halves. The first one deals with kind of, if you will, the heroic Alexander. I once heard a scholar of Hellenistic literature say, the minute Alexander died, he became a myth. And that's what this material deals with. The second half deals with his career of prophecy and also includes all of this sort of wonders of the world material that he copped from one source or another. So those are the two, if you will, resources, literary resources that Nezāmi draws on. Does that help? Okay. And yeah, I hope you have no intention to conquer the world. The paper I gave should stop you from doing that.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. One episode I found really striking in this is the episode where he finds the temple with the idol in it with the two gemstones for eyes, and he leaves it standing because he sees social utility in it, if I understood that correctly. Like he sees that it holds the community together, gives people hope or something like this, which strikes me as a very striking thing for a figure who's portrayed as a monotheistic prophet to be doing. And I guess what I want to ask is there precedent in sort of similar narratives from this time period of that sort of actions?
No. Again, it kind of comes from, I would appeal to kind of the Sufi background again. Sufis are fond of saying, whether you worship in the Kaaba or in a mosque or whether you worship in a monastery, it's all the same to God, as long as you're kind of doing that. I put this illustration back up because this is actually an illustration from a copy of Nezāmi's works that was prepared at the Mughal court in India. So this comes from, I'm guessing, the 1610s or so. For the Mughals, who are ruling over a largely Hindu population in India, this story was incredibly popular because this is sort of said, we Mughals are a tolerant ruler and we're going to allow for the practice of Hinduism without impediment. And so they really loved this scene. One of the great illustrations, I think, from the whole Nezāmi corpus. So what you get here is, again, sort of the merging of, if you will, sort of politics and mysticism, sort of a mystical worldview that says basically if you are a devout believer in a higher force, higher being, and you believe sincerely, that's fine. And so it kind of gets pulled into this. It gets pulled into the second half of the Book of Alexander. Does that get where you want? Go ahead.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Thank you very much for the talk. So I'm wondering, to go to the point about the poem as an architectural space and the architectural metaphor for the poem. How were all of Nezāmi's works figured in this way? I'm thinking of like the Makhzan al-Asrar, right, which is treasury of mysteries. You know,
Yeah.
are all these like how prevalent was the architectural fixation?
Well, it shows up here in particular, but it does come up in other poems. The other big poem that people like to talk about with Nezāmi in architecture is a poem called the Hath-Pekat, the Seven Figures, which really the entire plot of that narrative basically swings around the construction of two palaces. And he throws that in there too. But this was a not uncommon metaphor. You not only find it in Nezāmi, but you find it in other Persian poets as well, talking about the poem either as a building or more commonly as a garden that one wanders through. And when we say garden, we're talking about a elaborately kind of open air architecture. I mean, these are very elaborately planned and plotted gardens. So it's not unprecedented. What's interesting here is that it shows up at both the beginning and end of the poem, and at a crucial point where we're making the transition between the two halves. So it does kind of stand out here simply because you're kind of looking at buildings all the way through this poem. Except for battle scenes, there's not a lot that doesn't happen in an architectural setting that's usually described in some detail. Yes.
Thank you. So you mentioned in the beginning there's a relatively less attention to city building, which is something that we tend to associate much more, Alexander more, and more attention to these rather peculiar individual spaces and monuments. And so I was wondering, how do you read that? Is it just, from a rhetorical perspective, or from the perspective of the poet, is it just easier to talk about individual monuments than whole cities? So how do you see that?
Yeah, Nezāmi is enough of a poet, and we do have this very long description of the building of the stone, the fortress of lethal stones. So I don't think he backed away from it because he didn't feel like he could do it. I think I think part of it has to do with the fact that this was so much a part of the Alexander legend that he may have felt, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. But I think he's also, I think he's kind of looking at this almost from Alexander's perspective, which is Alexander, yeah, he built these cities and then left. And we do get a long description of Nushabeh's city. That city is very carefully, I think, gendered female. Cities, from Alexander's perspective, cities are not macho. To put it as delicately as I might. Cities are over luxurious. They're not the military thing. Not that, and that's one of the ironies, that Alexander's camp, when Nushabeh visits it, is just as elaborate as any of the city descriptions. Kind of an irony I didn't talk about and mention in the talk, but so I think it really has to do with the fact that both, I think, again, Nezāmi didn't really want to repeat stuff that everybody knew already, that was in the mythological era, as it were. But I also think that he has other fish to fry. He, like I say, I think he's kind of looking at these cities from Alexander's point of view, because it is really remarkable. I mean, because that's where this paper started. I'm going to look at Alexander as the builder of cities. Then I got into this poem and I went, well, that's 25 out of 10,000 verses. That wouldn't make much of a paper. But that's a very good question. I'll give that some more thought.
It's a very deliberate choice.
I think it's a very deliberate choice. Nezāmi is one of those poets who doesn't do anything without deliberation. Mm-hmm. What he was thinking, what he was deliberating when he did these things, who knows? But he was very deliberate.
We'll try a speculation. Could we see Alexander in this poem particularly as a mediating figure in the following way, that against the forces of urbanization, he has the power of the nomad, while retaining the power of civilization when faced with Gog and Magog and other nomads, that in some way it's deliberately trying to incorporate both.
Let me write that down. No, I think that's right. I mean, he's a figure who, he's a builder and a destroyer, and I don't think it's any accident that the order is always destroy then build. And so I think that, setting it in terms of kind of the nomadic, or I've been kind of thinking more about the military and the civilization, but the nomadic is just as good in this period, since most military forces were in fact nomads. I think Alexander himself would be appalled to find him just self-described as a nomad, but that's how he must have looked to the people whose territories he visited. He must have looked like a rowdy band of nomadic warriors. It's one of the many ways in which this poem kind of manipulates binaries. and sort of, okay, which side of the line is he on? Are we good? All right, well, thank you all very much.